honored to have Melissa Checker, who is the Hagedorn Professor of Urban Studies at Queens College. She's a professor of anthropology, and she's done a lot of work on essentially the urban process of creating eco-friendly neighborhoods. She's going to be making a presentation today on the art of rooftop gardens and the various ways that we've worked to transform New York's industrial waterfronts into green urban areas that are very enjoyable to the public. So with that, welcome, Dr. Checker, and we're excited about your talk.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. I'm starting off here with this rendering of the New York Wheel, a project that never actually came to fruition for reasons I can explain later. I first kind of became engaged with this project, the New York Wheel. It was about 2 weeks after Hurricane Sandy had pummeled the New York and New Jersey coastlines. And I went to Staten Island to a public meeting where there were about 150 Staten Islanders who, a lot of whom were still without electricity or power. And, we're still kind of really suffering from the devastation of Hurricane Sandy. And they attended this public meeting that was on the Staten Island's North Shore, not to discuss disaster recovery or flood protection or how to safeguard residents from future storms. But they came that night to hear about this plan to build a Ferris wheel in St. George, which is the neighborhood that's just adjacent to the Staten Island Ferry Terminal. And this project was a brainchild of then Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and it was meant to be the largest Ferris wheel on Earth, and an attraction unlike any other New York City or on the planet. So it was set to be 84 feet higher than the Singapore Flyer, which is currently the world's largest Ferris wheel. And it was going to run 24 hours a day. And then next to it, as part of the project, was a enormous 340,000 square foot designer outlet retail complex and a hotel. And also a very, very large parking garage. So the parking garage and the outlet mall actually did happen, and they're there now. So when I went to this public meeting, there were definitely some people there who were very much in favor of the project, but there were a pretty solid group of residents who were not happy to hear about this, particularly in the context of Hurricane Sandy. So only about a mile away, if you remember back that far, a large oil tanker had washed up on the shore. So this was definitely, you can see in the rendering, it's just right on the water. It was definitely in a flood zone. And people, would during the public comment period, went up to the mic and said things like, part of our island was just devastated in the floodplains, and this is going to be built in the floodplain. People were also worried, in addition to the flooding, about traffic on Richmond Terrace, which is already one of the most congested routes in the city, and that's this road that goes right here. And then other people, were wondering about the cost of the project, because these projects are extremely expensive. And then, of course, the residents of St. George who live nearby this area were worried about this 24-hour thing, and whether they were going to be lights shining on them all night and traffic all night. So what they were told by the person who was leading the meeting, who was affiliated with the New York City Economic Development Corporation, was that the structure was actually going to be lit by LED light bulbs powered with wind, solar, and water-based energy, and that the wheel would actually act as a buffer for floodwater, so that it was going to block the storm surges and cut high winds. But of course, as anybody knows, water has to go somewhere. So it might have like buffered the water in some way, but it would, it would spread around it. So this didn't really make residents feel any better. And even if, let's say, even if it was going to buffer them from storm surges, the environmental costs of just constructing this wheel were really considerable. So it was going to be importing materials from all over the world, disturbing this waterfront area that it was located on, and just the construction alone generates pollution. Plus, they were building this parking lot to go with it, which suggested that it was going to be a kind of car-based attraction. And so to me, the reason that I start my talk today with the story of the New York Wheel was because it sort of epitomized these contradictions of development in the sustainability, in the era of sustainability. And so it's those contradictions that really have interested me and that I've been researching for about a decade now. So in 2007, Michael Bloomberg released a plan called Plan YC 2030. And it laid out some sweeping and 127 initiatives for accommodating New York City's population, which Bloomberg predicted would rise by 1 million people by the year 2030, and while also retaining a commitment to sustainability. And so it pledged to reduce citywide carbon emissions by 30% below 2005 levels, and sort of started the process of a lot of so-called green development, new parks, waterfront areas, state-of-the-art energy efficient buildings. And a lot of these things, you know, there have been a lot of benefits from the plan, but there's also been a lot of things like the New York Wheel that a lot of developments that have come up on the waterfront that seem to really contradict the intentions of sustainability, and that a lot of people, especially in neighborhoods where these developments are occurring, has not really has had some negative consequences for the people in the neighborhoods where the development is occurring. So what I've been primarily interested in is how these kind of contradictions of sustainability play out in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. And one of my concerns has been what's happening as a lot of these neighborhoods, waterfront neighborhoods, become more green. What happens to the neighborhoods that are not greening? And my argument is that they're becoming more brown, so-called brown, which I'll talk about later on. But and the reason that one of the reasons that that the greening of these waterfronts is a problem is because it tends to accompany high-end redevelopment. And so the way that the mechanisms for sustainability are often very much linked to high-end redevelopment. And that's what I'm going to talk about, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So to study this problem, I used mostly ethnographic methods because I am an anthropologist. And I also used historical and archival research and a little bit of quantitative analysis, which I'll also discuss today. So in my research, I identified 3 types of environmental gentrification. Oh, sorry. So I call this process this kind of linkage between environmental improvements or eco-friendly initiatives and redevelopment. I call that environmental gentrification because it's sort of the linking of environmental improvements and gentrification, or again, the high-end redevelopment of particular neighborhoods. And I divide that category into 3 subcategories. One is called green gentrification, which would be the kind of installation of green amenities like parks, new waterfronts, sometimes bioswales, sometimes farmers markets, green roofs. So a lot of these things that are greening, and that's all part of the category of green gentrification. Then second category is one that I call industrial gentrification, which is the it's a kind of a down and upscaling of industrial facilities. and the remaking of former industrial sites into maker spaces or green and clean tech spaces, incubators. So a good example of this would be Industry City or the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where you now have these kind of remade industrial manufacturing areas that are very small scale. A lot of them have to do with artisanal food production, or again, clean tech or high tech industries, um, maybe artist spaces, and they're sort of being framed as being adding to the manufacturing economy, but they actually employ a very small number of people, and they're very kind of uh, they're also used as a amenity to. They're usually located in gentrifying neighborhoods and sort of used as part of that whole gentrification mechanism. So a lot of that is going on right now in Sunset Park. Is a pretty contentious area for that. And then the third kind of environmental gentrification I study is, I call it brown gentrification, which has to do with brownfield areas or contaminated sites that are underused or abandoned and that are being repurposed, cleaned up and repurposed for to sort of facilitate economic development. And that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today, is the brown gentrification. So to give you a little bit of background on what a brownfield site is, again, this is according to the City of New York's definition. It's an underused or vacant contaminated property, and it can contain any number of contaminants. And the idea is that because these sites are expensive to clean up, they impede development. So back in the Clinton era in 1990, about 1995, the Clinton administration instituted a federal brownfield program. And so this was something that was meant to incentivize redevelopment in low-income areas where these contaminated properties were seen to be impeding redevelopment. So they allowed developers they gave them tax write-offs so they could write off the cost of the cleanup of the site, and they gave them other kinds of incentives so that they could repurpose these properties and help spur development in these low-income neighborhoods that were, typically not being invested in. And so it offered. So prior to that, it was very difficult for city governments to find any way to incentivize the development of these sites. So initially, the program was was seen very positively by state elected officials, city elected officials, and environmental justice activists as well, because it was really targeted to low-income neighborhoods. And it became very popular, and all 50 states created their own version of the federal program. So they have state-level brownfield programs now. And in 2007, New York City became the first city in the nation to launch its own brownfield program. And this happened along with the release of Plan YC 2030. And that plan promised to clean up more than 7,000 acres of brownfield sites by the year 2030. And participants in the program, so developers who were willing to purchase and develop these contaminated properties, were able to deduct the cost of the cleanup. And they were going to be, the city would, once it approved the site for redevelopment, it would give them protection on future liability, which is a pretty good incentive for them. So the problem with this is that they were already finding that in a lot of state programs, especially the New York State Brownfield program, that because the incentive to developers, so it's incentivizing developers, but developers are still not going to purchase one of these properties and clean it up and repurpose it unless they can bank on future profits, right? So it's something that is really a program that's tying cleanup to some kind of profit incentive, sort of future profits and incentives. So they were finding already that most of the cleanups were happening in neighborhoods that were already had where property values were going up or were forecast to go up or were already pretty high. And so what New York City did to kind of try to offset some of those, that uneven distribution, was to initiate a program that would um, like give the money to nonprofit developers so that they would be developing things like affordable housing sites and things that were sort of more community oriented. And that was the city's way of trying to sort of even out the distribution of brownfield sites. And we'll talk about whether or not that was successful. The other thing that New York City did in its program was it really streamlined the process for approval. And so approval for getting these sites into the program or cleaned up and permitted and remediated all went through one city agency rather than having to go through some kind of city council process or community board approval process. So really it took less than a year for a developer to apply for the program and then to start remediation, which in this bureaucracy is pretty impressive. So to take a look, one of the things I really wanted to look at was how this, how the distribution of the brownfield programs that were funded by the city, how they were distributed across the 5 boroughs, and how they aligned or didn't align with gentrification. So I'm assuming all of you have a pretty good idea of what gentrification is. It's the sort of, just really briefly, it's this sort of changing over of a low income, often formerly industrialized neighborhood, but not always a low income neighborhood that's been suffering from disinvestment for many years. And suddenly a lot of new investment starts coming in, and then property values start to rise, new buildings come in, new kinds of stores come in, and the neighborhood eventually sort of changes over to become more of a upwardly mobile, maybe middle-class neighborhood. It often also accompanies a lot of demographic changes in the neighborhood. So I worked with 2 colleagues. One is my colleague Scott Larson in the Department of Urban Studies, and the other is Glenn Johnson, who's at the CUNY School of Public Health, and he specializes in spatial analysis. And the 3 of us got together, and the first thing we did was we came up with an index to kind of describe gentrification and to map out where it had been occurring across the city. And I'm not going to get too wonky with all of this, but I can talk, come back to it in the questions and answers. But we chose 4 variables that had to do with proportion of population that is non-Hispanic white. And we were looking at the change, so the whitening of particular neighborhoods, since that's a feature of gentrification usually. The proportion of the population that has a 4-year college degree, because education is another really big indicator of gentrification. Age, since often young people are sort of on the vanguard. A lot of young people will start moving into an area and it becomes kind of like a hip place with lots of bars and restaurants and clubs, and then other people start moving in there. And then the rent, we were looking at the rising rents in the neighborhood. So we were looking at all these variables as a percent of change over time. And this is what we came up with. Hopefully you can see it, but I don't know if I can expand it, but hopefully you can see it. So basically the darker the area, the higher it's scored on our gentrification index. And if you can see where the darkest areas are, they would be here, Central Brooklyn, right? And also Williamsburg, Greenpoint area. Here, Long Island City, Harlem. So pretty much aligns with what we expected. And then you see here the outer parts of the outer boroughs are much lower on the gentrification index. So now if we look at, and this map is sort of hard to read. I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to zoom. But these little purple dots, if you can see them, these are these are New York City funded brownfield sites. And so if you can see on the map, when we put them against the gentrification index, the areas that were more likely to be gentrifying, they sort of tended to cluster. Like these are all in Williamsburg and Greenpoint. So that area has 48% of the projects, of the brownfield projects funded by the city, were in Brooklyn, and most of those were clustered in Williamsburg and Greenpoint. And then we can see some more sort of here in Queens, and then on the west side of Manhattan. So it accorded pretty well with the gentrification map. At least we could see the clustering of these sites accorded with gentrification, despite the fact that the city had tried to sort of mitigate for that with this community-based program or nonprofit-based program. And then this is for comparison. So in this map, Staten Island didn't even really show up because they have so few brownfield sites. And it also is like way smaller. That I don't know why it came out so small. It's like a weird GIS thing. But here's a close-up of Staten Island North Shore, and you can see that there are very few completed brownfield projects. So especially, compared to all of these projects that you see here in Brooklyn and then parts of Manhattan and Queens. And so so just to give you an example of what the kinds of things that brownfield sites are repurposed. So again, it's a vacant, unused, contaminated industrial property, and then it gets cleaned up and repurposed to foster economic development. So here's one example of, this is a cluster of brownfield sites known as Greenpoint Landing. And some of these buildings, this is a rendering, so some of these towers are still under construction, but this is really advertised or promoted as a green project, partly because of it's repurposing contaminated sites. And then you can see these towers have green roofs on them. And there's a golf course somewhere in here. There's like tennis courts. There's lots of outdoor space. So this is kind of like going to be eventually, a landmark, one of the city's really landmark green developments, new energy efficient, state-of-the-art green developments. And it's along the Newtown Creek, which is being cleaned up, which is a huge Superfund site. And the EPA is cleaning it up. So eventually the creek will be clean, and you'll have this project with a marina and opportunities for people to kayak and do all kinds of things on the East River. Another example of a brownfield project is the Gowanus Whole Foods Market. And this is what it was. And then now it's in 2013, they opened this Whole Foods, which is right along the Gowanus Canal. And it's one of the largest Whole Foods, or it's definitely the largest Whole Food in the city. It includes an in-house record shop, a bike repair station, a rooftop beer garden, and a 20,000 square foot commercial rooftop greenhouse, which was the largest in the country at that time. And so when this Whole Food opened, property values in Gowanus were very much on the rise. And the median rent in the neighborhood was increasing, had already increased between 2013 and 2014, it increased by 17.4%. And median home values went up by 6%. And the Gowanus Canal was also a contaminated waterway that was part of a Superfund site that the EPA was cleaning up. And I'm going to come back to Gowanus in a minute, but you can see that these contaminated properties are really kind of being repurposed often as these green sort of sites. And then this is not one that's being built as a green site, but I just think it's kind of interesting. This is another brownfield from Harlem that became a Scientology center. a lot of these things, the other thing about the brownfields is even though they're being funded or incentivized through city money, um, they're not necessarily serving a purpose that benefits a community at large. They're sort of often targeted to very particular communities. Again, because they are tied to these economic incentives and to real estate development. So, so the well, I'll get to that. I'll get to some of the consequences of this later. But to continue with the comparison to Staten Island, so I'm going to take you now back to the North Shore of Staten Island. I'll show you a quick map here. So this is the North Shore of Staten Island. This would be the ferry. This is where the wheel project was like right around here. And then if you continue further west along the northern shore, you get to this kind of 5-mile stretch of land here that used to be called Staten Island's Gold Coast. And it's a highly industrialized strip of land that's right along the Kilvan Coal, which is this water body that goes here. And then this is Bayonne, New Jersey. So it kind of ends up dividing Staten Island from New Jersey. So on the North Shore of Staten Island, this is a container ship that goes along the coal. Again, it's heavily industrialized, partly because there's a large container port there. So you have these massive container ships that are coming in from all over the world to the port. And then there's trucks going in there, in and out every day, picking up materials and driving them all over the place. There's actually, along that 5-mile strip I showed you, there's 21 contaminated properties that residents and have identified and that the EPA has verified as being contaminated. So here's an example of some of them. This is an industrial salt plant. There's also, let's see, a Department of Sanitation garage, a sewer treatment plant, several bus depots, and a lot of these sit on top of on sites that were former factories. So you kind of get multiple contaminants. You have like a former factory site, and then you'll have some like a municipal facility on top of it. So you get these kind of multiple layers of heavy metals and different contaminants. And all of them are within 70 feet of residential properties. So here you can see this is a residential street where people's homes are, and then you just go across this little 2-lane road, which is Richmond Terrace, and then you get to the industrial sites, which are on the waterway. So part of the problem too is that the waterway is heavily contaminated, and in fact part of it is part of its own Superfund site, because which is contaminated with heavy metals. Often, most of them are actually coming from the Jersey side. But then you also have the super tankers going through the water, which are adding to the contamination of the water, and all of the area is low-lying and it's in a flood zone. So when you have nor'easters or heavy storms, areas flood. And here's an example of flooding on Richmond Terrace. This is the Bayonne Bridge. And this site behind this fencing here is one of their most famous, most notorious contaminated properties, which is a pretty small site that was part of the, it was part of the Manhattan Project in the 1940s. It was a storehouse owned by Archer Daniels Midlands. It stored linseed, and then during the war, the company loaned it out to the US government, and they were using it to store uranium that was being shipped in from the Belgian Congo. And during one of those shipments, the uranium was leaking. They don't know exactly. It either spilled or it leaked, and it soaked into the grounds of the property, of the warehouse, and it was never cleaned up. It still to this day has not been cleaned up, even though it's been tested several times by both the state and the federal EPA, and they found high levels of radiation there. And the community members have been trying to get it cleaned up and they've gotten it finally listed on as a national priority on the national priority list of sites to be cleaned up, but they haven't allocated the funding yet to clean it. But you can see that with the flooding, people were nervous about this site in particular, but they were nervous about all the sites because the floodwaters can kind of, it's possible that the floodwaters can spread the contaminants around. It doesn't always happen, but it's certainly possible. So, and then another problem is that people tend to fish off the piers in the water here. And so they put up the community members had fought for a long time to get these signs put up, because for a long time there were no signs warning people not to fish. So basically, to sum up, the people who lived on the North Shore, they were facing multiple environmental threats. So they were facing threats from the contaminants in the water and the land. They were also facing threats from flooding and sea level rise. So the floods were intensifying every year. And it was more frequent that people's basements were being flooded, and they were getting streets flooded, and they were having to kind of deal with that. And then the other threat that they were facing that sort of exacerbated everything was that this was a very low income area. And so about 25% of the population in the main part of this area fell below the federal poverty line, and about 1/3 of people were identified as Hispanic, non-white, and about almost 1/3 as African American. And a lot of people here were, there were a lot of communities of immigrants from different places. So this was an area that is sort of not usually talked about, or, well, I guess it's kind of under the radar. For Staten Island, usually when you hear about Staten Island, you think of like middle-class homeowners, people that work for the city, largely white, largely Republican. But in this part of Staten Island, which was actually pretty densely populated area along the North Shore, it was very different. In fact, the population looked a lot more like other parts of New York City. And so they, it was thought of that these people were not going to, they didn't have a lot of political clout or power. So that was one reason that toxic sites accumulated in this area, was because they didn't think that the people would contest them. And then to make matters worse, so these were things that have been there for a while, but the city was kind of constantly trying to permit new things to be, new facilities to be sited on the North Shore, including at one point they were going to put in this eco-friendly cement plant. And that was from the website of this never actually happened, but this is a picture of an eco-friendly cement plant in case you were wondering what one looked like. Also, a natural gas pipeline went in there. They were going to expand the container port at one point, and there was also they wanted to put in a new dredged facility to treat dredged soils, which I'll talk about in a second. And then what happened was, to top it all off, in 2013, the city designated a new industrial business zone. And this part is along that same area that I was talking about, that same corridor. But it's very close to where people live. And so the people that live there and that are already dealing with a lot of contaminants were not happy that there was this new business zone, which was incentivizing industrial businesses to locate there. So the point of this is that it gives you, it's a stark contrast between what was going on in the industrialization, the browning of the North Shore, and the greening of other parts of the city like Greenpoint, Williamsburg, Harlem, and Gowanus. And so one of the things that I was also looking at was whether the kind of cleanup of some of these neighborhoods that were gentrifying, that we saw in the gentrification scale, what was the impact of that environmentally on neighborhoods that were not gentrifying, like Staten Island's North Shore, which is right about here, right? So, and one of my hypotheses, and I haven't really been able to collect enough, kind of hard data because it's hard to get to about this, but my findings suggest is that once an area cleans up, and gentrifies, it's no longer really a place where you're going to site a hazardous waste producing facility. So they're not going to put something really noxious into Williamsburg and Greenpoint, or it's unlikely because the residents of Williamsburg and Greenpoint at this point will fight it off. And so as more of these waterfront neighborhoods gentrify, you have fewer and fewer places where you can put hazardous waste producing facilities. And so they're tending to cluster even more in areas that are already affected by a disproportionate number of them, like, for example, the North Shore. And I'll sort of end with one quick story about that, which illustrates this point, which is, so as I mentioned, the Gowanus Canal is part of a very large Superfund cleanup. And it's been something that's been very contentious for a lot of years, but the EPA is cleaning up the canal. And as I said, the neighborhood alongside the canal is has been gentrifying pretty rapidly around it. And back in, let's see, back again in, I think this was in 2014 or 15, the EPA was discussing their plan for how they were going to do the cleanup. And part of that plan included what was going to happen to the materials that they were dredging up, the sludge from the Gowanus Canal. And the initial idea that they had was they were going to take it just a mile down the road and treat it off the coast of Red Hook, which is another gentrifying neighborhood, and turn it into this kind of concrete mix. So they were going to decontaminate the soils and then mix them with concrete and then use it for construction projects. But the people in Red Hook and Gowanus and Carroll Gardens, which is also in that area, raised a fit, and they didn't want this material being treated anywhere near them. They got a huge bunch, they did a great job of organizing. They got lots of residents. They had a couple of meetings with the EPA where residents just went nuts and really were very vocal about the fact that they didn't want the sludge treated there. So finally, the EPA just said, okay, forget it. We're taking it. Don't worry. We're not going to treat it anywhere near here. Not going to be treated in Brooklyn. Now, this happened, and then about maybe like 6 or 7 months later, the people on the North Shore got news that one of their facilities wanted to expand so that it could start processing dredged materials and repurpose them into concrete mixtures, which was exactly the same process that was described for the Gowanus Canal. So it appeared that they were had just moved that project over to the North Shore. And then residents on the North Shore were also furious and didn't want this stuff because they already were dealing with all these other contaminants. And they raised a big fuss too at public meetings. But in their case, they were not successful. Now the facility never ended up getting built, but the reason had nothing to do with the fact that residents were so opposed to it. It had to do with the fact that it turned out the owner of the facility was implicated in a murder, but that's a whole other story, which I won't go into. But so you can see that there's a real, again, a strong suggestion that that there are serious consequences of some of these greening programs and of the cleaning up and greening and gentrifying of certain neighborhoods. And the impact is not just, on the, if it impacts the environmental quality in these kind of more out of the way neighborhoods, and that in turn affects people's environmental health. And so it's a serious problem because, and with the Brownfield program, if you're incentivizing people to clean up contaminated sites by giving them sort of making it easier for them to redevelop those sites, and the redevelopment itself is tied to their idea of, being able to make a profit in the future, there's no mechanism to clean up contaminated sites in neighborhoods where the property values are not going up. And so if you don't decouple that, then you end up with an even more sort of unequal and unbalanced city where some people in some neighborhoods their environmental health will be improving and their neighborhoods will be getting more clean and sustainable. And then people who live in these out of the way, low income places that are not so attractive to development or gentrification are just having to contend with more and more environmental problems. And I will stop it there.
Well, thank you. That was, so first of all, I'd like to just put out some questions. I bet some of the graduate students would be interested in asking some questions. So you can either type or just unmute yourself and you can just ask Melissa herself. Okay. So otherwise I can come up with a bunch of questions. Okay, so I'll start off with a question because this is brand new to me. I'm not a brownfields person at all. And the amount of intrigue that you talked about, murders and corruption and this and that, and just your last slide here, just showing, I didn't realize that there was so many brownfield sites in New York City. So do you have any idea of how many, or I guess you have the map of how many brownfield sites, how many have been actually cleaned up? Because I bet most New Yorkers don't know anything about how many contaminated zones we have.
Yeah, so this map is really just of sites, like for example, these purple dots are just sites that have that are in the program for being cleaned up. So I think the city has about I can't remember the numbers offhand. I think it's about more than 7,000. And so far, maybe they've cleaned up, I don't know, it's probably a couple hundred. So yeah, there's a lot of them. But this includes, when they talk about brownfields, they include like gas stations that are, have vacant, and lots of just old places that used to have factories. So there's a lot of them out there. But yeah, there are lots.
You said 7,000?
It was 7,000 acres of, let's see.
Okay.
I have the number in here somewhere.
No, it's okay. But it just seems outstanding, just seeing how many sites and how many places that I've gone to and been to, and Red Hook and this and that, and all along basically almost the entire coast of Western Brooklyn and Western Queens seems to be some sort of contaminated zone. Is that true? Yeah. Am I reading the map right? That all that red is bad?
Oh, so in this is actually, these are areas, these darker areas this is brownfield sites overlaid with gentrification. Yeah. Okay. But I mean, there are a lot of, I mean, especially in this part of Queens here.
Yeah, the little purple circles.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. Just incredible. Okay, so I started seeing some questions from some of the students. This is from Max. I guess my first question has to do with the environmental consultants. What role do they play in this process, and what degree of transparency is there?
Yeah, well, that is a great question. And that is something I write about in more detail in the chapter that you read. So the whole Brownfield program, what they do is if you apply to the program and once you're accepted, the city gives you a list of consultants that will, assess your site, right? They'll assess the degree of contamination and then give you some ideas about how it can be remediated. And then those same consultants are often the ones that end up doing the remediation. And so there's a kind of incestuous process there with the Brownfield assessment and cleanup. And it's a couple of, there's a list of consulting firms. It's not necessarily a huge number of them that end up bidding on these projects. And a lot of times they're kind of, that if they're working for a developer, then they're going to be offering the most cost efficient cleanup possible. So
Mm.
they're often, you know, at least people that I work with who are usually environmental justice activists in the community really feel that they cut a lot of corners with these cleanups. So they'll do a lot of like capping and, you know, again, the most cost effective thing, which isn't always, I mean, sometimes it's okay, but it's not always the best way to actually like fully, thoroughly remediate these sites. And some of them are repurposed as schools or homes. There's a lot of brownfield sites that get repurposed as schools. So it causes a lot of concern in the neighborhoods.
Wow. You're not making me feel any better. So, schools. We have another question. Of the money allocated to brownfield redevelopment, how much money was given to nonprofits and community plans versus private for-profit companies?
Yeah, that is a very complicated question and also a great question. So, you know, in some cases, and I don't have any pictures on this presentation, but I have other ones, you know, they were given to like, you know, pretty legit affordable housing corporations, you know, low nonprofits, but sometimes it's a little dodgy. So a particular project will say that there's like they'll develop a nonprofit entity to maybe act as the developer to apply for the money, but it's often going for a purpose that's not necessarily so community oriented, or it'll be part of a larger development that's very much of a for-profit based development. So there was one project that was very controversial around Yankee Stadium, and it wasn't a nonprofit, but they were developing this hotel, and they were saying, well, this is going to bring a lot of jobs to people because, you know, the hotel will hire people. And they built it as this community-based project and ended up getting the community-based money, but nobody in the neighborhood was really very supportive of putting in a hotel. So, you know, there's been a lot of kind of shady things like that.
Wow. So I am learning so much here. We have another question from Gottfried. Why was there little consideration for allowing local communities to get actively involved in the site cleanup practices in the first place, even if the developers were involved?
Yeah, well, and that's another issue with this is in that process of streamlining, which was something that they used to really attract the developers by saying, you know, because normally development in New York City is a very arduous process where you have to get all kinds of, you know, approvals and permits and often go through these community boards, and developers are constantly complaining about it. So part of the Brownfield program was they said, you know, we've been able to establish this. If you kind of go through brownfields, you can cut through a lot of that red tape. And because this is a specialized program, we don't have to go through the same process that other kinds of developments have to go through. And it was another perk of the program. But the problem is that you don't get a lot of community input. There is a community process for where people can kind of comment on the cleanup plan, but you have to read this enormous plan. It's usually housed at a library, so you have to go to the library. You have to get this like 150-page document and look through it and decide whether you think the cleanup is adequate, which, you know, most community members are not going to do. So there's really very little community input into the process, which, yeah, is a problem since, yeah.
Okay, I have a question from Diana. I have a general question. Based on the map, there are a lot of brownfield sites, which is shocking for me to see, as it was for me. But how is it decided which ones are remediated, with a lot of them probably being on the same level of contamination? Interesting.
Right, and that's a great question too. So the basis for deciding which of the sites will get remediated has to do with if they're part of the brownfield program, the developer decides really. So a developer has to say, I want to, you know, I choose this property, I want to remediate it, and then it gets, you know, then they apply for the program, and it gets remediated. So if the developers don't choose that property, then it just sits there, which is again a big part of like using this as a mechanism for cleanup.
Wow. So it's really up to the developer to move on these brownfield sites?
Yeah, for this program. Now, other really heavily contaminated sites could be part of the Superfund program, or they might be part of the state has its own Superfund program. So some sites that are, larger and more, it reaches a certain level of contamination, and they'll, be part of a state or federally funded
Okay.
cleanup. But for these that are sort of more contained and not quite as egregiously contaminated, the brownfield program is the only way to really clean them up.
Okay. Well, so I have more questions, but I'm going to let the graduate students talk today, and the undergraduates, by the way. I have another one for Max. Is there a potential role for scientific community as advocates for low-income communities? Is this being practiced anywhere?
Yes, and yes. Yeah, there is a great role for that. And, really what a lot of these people that I work with in these communities, what they need is scientists to, help them out. And there are a lot of people that are trying to do more kind of community-based science, which doesn't mean that sometimes it means the community itself is collecting data, but other times it just means that they're sort of really taking, I have another example from another research project I did where it was a community that was contaminated by a local factory. And, that people had come out to test their soil, and the community had been fighting forever to get the EPA to come out there and test their soil. And they were really believed that they were contaminated. So a lot of them imported soil to put over the contaminated soil. But the EPA didn't bother to ask that question. And so when they did their sampling, they didn't sample all the way down to the original soil. They sampled the topsoil people had brought in. Now, if you had, some kind of scientists that are actually there and thinking, well, let's talk to the community members and see where they think we should, how far down we should bore, and ask them like what they've been doing to protect themselves on their own, then they would have known, they would have known that that was an issue. So there's lots of room for scientists to work with community members, and just, even just really listening to them is helpful.
Wow. Whew. So actually I have a question from a former undergraduate student. Okay, so thank you for such a great talk. I really enjoyed it. For the last point you made, what would you suggest to be an incentive for developers instead of write-offs? Could maybe turn into a program to create new small businesses? Maybe the city can create ways to help pay for the cost of remediation via loan plan? Good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. And I think, I think maybe one idea could be something that was, they could take the kind of community benefit aspect of the development a little more seriously, and just kind of have a more thorough process of getting feedback from community members about what kinds of things that they need in that neighborhood. That's one thing they could do is just, they already have sort of given lip service to that, but to actually really make it meaningful and take it seriously. Another thing that they could do is to try and, instead of, this is sort of, I guess, unrealistic, but, if there was more actual public money for these cleanups, so it didn't have to be so tied to private development, then that would, that would be better, because there would be more accountability, public accountability to it. Of course, I don't know where that would come from. That's not my area. That's my cop-out answer, but
That's okay. So we have another question, which is similar to Max's question. Has there been a brownfield cleanup and remediation geared toward more community-based approaches rather than private interest development, like
yeah,
community gardens and stuff?
Yeah, there are some examples. In fact, there's a few examples in the Bronx and in Queens where, again, they have, these affordable housing corporations have done, sponsored the cleanups. And, there are some examples where they've turned, this sounds weird, there's a couple of senior centers or senior living facilities that are on top of brownfield sites. They really do turn them into all kinds of things. But, some of those are, we certainly need more senior housing, and assuming that the cleanup was done well. You know, those kinds of things. So there are scattered examples, but what I was looking at is, you know, the aggregate, the kind of general trends. But sure, I mean, I'm happy to say that there are examples throughout the city of projects that people are happy with.
So, so any other questions? Okay. So I would just like to thank you. Oh, Jillian.
Yeah, I just have a couple of quick questions. One is there, like, if you live in a community, where do you go to find out whether or not there are brownfields near you and what they're contaminated with? Because how would you know if it's radioactive versus heavy metals versus organic, whatever?
Yeah, there's a couple ways. There are some websites. So the city has one database. It's called SPEDES. It's SPED, I think ES. It's through the city planning website. And you can put in an address, and like if you have the address of the property, it'll come up and tell you what its former uses were and whether there are contaminants there and what they are. There's also a map that the city has, which I think is wonky. I mean, this is where I got this. Just got this last night off the city's map, and this is like also through the Department of City Planning. And you can put in like your zip code or your neighborhood, and it'll pop up, and you can check off different boxes. I just checked these boxes off, but you can also put like Superfund and different things. And then I think if you click on the site, it might give you more detail. And then there's another good nonprofit that runs a site. It used to be called Scorecard. It's called something else now, but if you just go to scorecard.org, and you can put in an address or a zip code, and it'll tell you what all the toxic sites are. And then if you click on the site, it'll come up with the list of contaminants and how it's listed and whether it's, you know, being remediated and stuff. So that would be like the one where I would start, is Scorecard.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Any last questions? So, okay. So I would like to thank you, Melissa. That was an amazing talk. I learned
Thank
a
you
lot
so
today.
much.
And hopefully the students, you know, are taken away with all these brownfield sites around New York. This gives us the potential for our graduating students to maybe get some jobs, you know?
Sure, there's lots of, you know, I guess there are a lot of environmental consultants out there. So
Absolutely.
go into that.
Yeah, so it's actually, there's a lot of it. I would say that the big take-home message would be, or one of them would be, there's a lot more work yet to be done. Yes.
For sure. For
So,
sure.
so anyway, thank you so much again, Melissa, and thank you for attending, everyone.
Thank you all. Take care.
Take care. Bye bye.